Hi, I'm Bryce Conway, and the 1002nd album you should hear is Jethro Tull's A Passion Play.
Hi, I'm Jeff Stephen, and you're listening to the 1002nd Album podcast. I spent 10 years going through the 1001 albums you must hear before you die, and now I'm asking people that are important to me all about the albums that are important to them. Enjoy! This is the 1002nd Album podcast. I'm Jeff Stephen. I'm particularly excited about today's episode. For today, my guests, well, there are English teachers, there are ultimate frisbee players, and there are even those that deliver Wayne's World 2 monologues verbatim, but very few can do all three with such great aplomb. So it is my pleasure today to welcome Bryce Conway.
Oh, thanks so much. I remember that Wayne's World monologue.
It was a long time ago when I was a young man. The album of choice is Jethro Tull, A Passion Play. And I guess my first question would be, where did your Jethro adventure begin?
So I guess for me, it started off, I listened to a lot of prog rock albums growing up. My dad was really into prog rock, so it would be bands like Genesis, Jethro Tull, Yes, ELP. And I kind of just listened, I would wake up in the morning to like Aqualung or whatever it would happen to be. That would be my alarm clock. And then I ended up taking all of his records when I moved out. So he had gotten rid of most of them at that point, but I was able to grab Thick as a Brick, Passion Play, and a few others. So it just became a thing where I'm going to start this record collection, and I have 7 albums, and 5 of them are Jethro Tull. So, yeah.
I like that. The flute is a good way to start the day, and Jethro Tull is a nice foundation for an album collection too. For sure. It's funny, for me, mine was slightly less of a romantic tale where it was Owen Wilson in Armageddon and saying that really bothered him when they thought Jethro Tull was someone in the band.
Yeah.
So, so I've learned my lesson that there's much more to them than that.
I think the real Jethro Tull was he was an agriculturist who invented like the seed drill.
Oh,
okay. So he's the real Jethro Tull.
He's just not in the band.
He's not down
Nice, I like it. So you mentioned Aqualung as well, and on the book I went through, the 1001 albums you must hear before you die, they only included Aqualung. Of all the discography, only Aqualung made the cut. And my suspicion is that the editors must have felt that, well, maybe one album is sufficient to give the idea of the band. And I guess my question for you would be, well, why were the list editors sorely mistaken here?
I mean, on one hand, I get it. I can see why they would put one on there. Aqualung's a great album. As a single, the song is probably the one that most people know. And Locomotive Breath would be like maybe the other song that I think, if you only know one or two Jethro Tull songs, those are the two, and they're both on that record. But I think it's probably just Aqualung is more accessible. If you're going to sit down and listen to 4 minutes, then great, like that'll do it. But as far as this album, and for me, this is just like peak prog Jethro Tull, like weirdness.
And he needs slightly more than 4 minutes.
yeah, exactly. I mean, it's not the type of album you can just sort of put on for 2 minutes, because I mean, you'll get like, the first 2 minutes is just like a heart beating, right? Mm-hmm. So, but yeah, this is a much more involved listening experience. It definitely forces a more like active listen. But I think for me, this is just like the pinnacle of like 70s prog rock, at least. That might be a bit of a contentious opinion.
But you make it convincingly, though. And it's funny to hear you speak so glowingly of the album, because when I was looking into this, it was one I was unfamiliar with. And so I looked into it, and I gather the album was not really that warmly received at the time. And the one review that sort of made me chuckle was by Ian Anderson. And who is Ian Anderson?
Ian Anderson is the flautist, concert flautist, and frontman.
So the review I saw, according to Ian Anderson, frontman, flautist of Jethro Tull, I saw Ian Anderson was quoted as saying, "I've always thought that A Passion Play suffered more than any other album I've ever made from being over-arranged, overproduced, and overcooked." And there's more. And also that Jethro Tull fans, who call the album their favorite, and I quote, "should of course remain in the establishment for the criminally insane in which they probably already reside." Discuss.
Yeah, so that we gotta unpack a little bit there. So It is kind of overproduced. It is a little bit. It's probably a little bit more self-indulgent. They spent way too much time. So the sort of history behind why this album exists is because they released "Thick as a Brick" a year earlier, and that album was essentially just a big send-up of the epic progressive rock album. And they were like, "Hey, like all these people are coming up with these ridiculous, albums. Let's do one of our own, except let's parody it." And that's what "Thick as a Brick" was meant to be. They'd just been touring with Yes, and Ian Anderson saw all the band members of Yes taking themselves so seriously.
Right.
So the first line of "Thick as a Brick" is, "I really don't mind if you sit this one out," basically making fun of the other bands they were touring with.
Right.
So that's what "Thick as a Brick" was meant to be. And essentially with a passion play, after "Thick as a Brick" was so incredibly popular, they were like, "Wait a minute, hold on a minute, that record was a joke. Like, if you want us to actually put out this rich progressive album, well, like, we can do that." So that's what Passion Play was meant to be. The problem is that the recording of the album was just fraught with issues. They went to Switzerland to try and record it for tax reasons, and then they went to this studio where there were bed bugs and they were all getting food poisoning and the equipment was horrible, and they just hated every second of it, and they had to scrap the whole album. So they came back to England, they re-recorded it, and by the time they had finished the album, it was just a complete, they were like, "Oh, well, I'm ready to be done with this, like, let's just move on." So Ian's kind of right. It is overproduced because they had to make the album twice. I think some people would probably say it suffers from some issues that "Thick as a Brick" didn't have. "Thick as a Brick" is this really like cool flowing piece where everything just kind of like goes in. Right. You can follow this trajectory, and there's really cool musical motifs that show up repeatedly. With the Passion Play, the album just kind of happens to you. Yes. So you're listening to one thing, and then immediately you're sort of thrust in another direction, and it's super jarring at times. The criticism that he has of his own work is, I think, a little bit valid. Yeah. But it's just, it's so good. Yeah. Like, there are so many like pieces. Like, you can listen to it so many times and hear something new each time, which I love. So I think I get it. Yeah.
And that's I was wondering when I read it, because it was so scathing. I was wondering if it was almost like, the reverse psychology where the parents saying to the child, like, "Oh, don't eat those vegetables," like sort of like trying to, maybe drum up demand in an unconventional way. But I see what you mean, where maybe they were so fed up with the recording process, just we're done with that one. The and you also mentioned too, the thing with the record that came before, "Thick as a Brick." Yeah. It was easy to follow. It was things were happening very sort of logically. This one here, I really didn't know what was going on. So I think I was of that audience where the album happened to me. And it was something I didn't... I gather it is a concept album. But do you think in order, like, for someone like me or somebody listening to this record for the first time, to maximize their enjoyment, do you think that the listener really needs to know that it's a concept album? Or do they really have to have a clue what's going on? Or can they just sit back and allow it to be?
I mean, this has been my favorite album for years and years and years, and I only really tried to figure out what it was about. Maybe like, I don't know, it was like at the beginning of the pandemic. I was like, I had a lot of free time. Let's figure out what Passion Play is all about. And so absolutely not. I mean, you don't need to know what's going on at all. I have no idea what 90% of the lyrics are about. I think with this album, that's like secondary. For someone who really thrives on that and sort of like needs to dig into it, then good luck. Maybe you might have some luck there, but I mean, not for me. I just love the music. It's just the instrumental parts are my favorite anyway. The basic story behind the album is that I'm gonna butcher this, I'm sure, but it's essentially this look into the afterlife. So the protagonist, I'm a little bit curious. You can tell me how much of this you forgot when you listen.
As long as you mention spectacles at some point, I'm like, yes, you got that.
Yeah. So it's about a man named Ronnie Pilgrim who dies at the beginning. He witnesses his own funeral and he's sent to heaven. He goes to heaven. He hangs out for a while. He's like, "No, I'm not sure if this is for me. Let's try the other place." So he goes to hell. He goes to hell and says, "Oh, this isn't it either." Like, so he sort of eventually decides or is granted resurrection. Okay. Now, I don't know. Is that ringing any bells?
Not especially, but it's more. It's probably I was more just in awe of everything that was going on. Like at first, I was getting this. Did you ever see the musical Bye Bye Birdie?
No.
So there was in the opening movement, it had this sort of like do 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 do,
that's right.
which is like it brought me to like Bye Bye Birdie, which is there, and then there was another part that sort of went in more of a like just before the solo and Stairway to Heaven direction. It was sort of taking me on this musical journey that I was sort of aware of words happening, but it was only when it got into some spoken stuff that I really started to pick up on that stuff. But it's neat. So no, it's neat to hear some of the themes behind it that maybe weren't obvious at first glance. But I think at least from my perspective, that didn't seem to hinder my enjoyment at all, because I found being lost. I guess you can go one of two ways, where you could say like, oh, this is bananas. This isn't for me. But for me, I sort of thought, well, this is bananas, or this is bonkers. But I'm really intrigued by it. Yeah. And so I want to hear more, and I want to go back and, like you said, peel back some of those layers and see what happens on the next listen. And it's one of those things that definitely, more has revealed each time. So,
well, halfway through, I mean, as soon as you flip over the record, there's this. It's called the Forest Dance. And then 2 minutes into the second side, you have this absurdist children's tale.
Yes.
The Hare Who Lost His Spectacles, narrated by the Jeffrey Hammond, who was the bass player for the band at the time.
Okay.
And I have no idea. Like, it's just so weird.
Yes.
I have no idea what its purpose is, but I can't turn it off.
Nope. And it's funny. I had that same feeling too. Like, as soon as it almost sounded like John Oliver shouting at the beginning of it, like, and now there. And but I needed closure on the story to see what became of the poor hare, and as we both wear spectacles, so we could relate to that dilemma of misplacing them. And so it kind of reminded me of did you ever hear Brian Wilson's Smile?
Yeah, absolutely.
So about halfway through the running order of that, all of a sudden he starts singing about chowing down on his vegetables. So like, again, with the overpronounced word, like another syllable just in there. And it's, again, when back in 2003 or whenever that was, I thought, this is ridiculous, but yet I love it and I need more. And
so weird that the other Beach Boys didn't want him to put that song in.
Yeah. It's just seamless in the running order. But I thought it was, I'm not sure if I'll ever fully understand it, but I think it's still possible to immerse in it all the same. So it's good. I guess the good news about an exercise like this is that there's probably a lot of right answers for, well, what is the 1,000-second album you must hear? But according to you, if you had one sort of closing argument, why would you say this is the 1,000-second album that one must hear?
So I've been thinking about this, and I think it just comes down to the fact that everyone has an opinion about this record once you've heard it. Among Jethro Tull fans, I'm going to Tull skulls. I hate that. But among Jethro Tull fans, I mean, there's a big divide, I guess.
Okay.
A lot of people think that Thick as a Brick is like vastly superior, and this is just completely self-indulgent trash.
Yeah.
The other side of that is, even if you have no desire to listen to another Jethro Tull song in your life after this, you can at least hold the opinion that it's weird and it's wacky and zany. And I think if you haven't really listened to a lot of like progressive 70s rock, this is like a really, 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 really good like album to get a listen to. So I think it just sort of represents. I had to look at the list, and I don't think there's. It's funny. There's a lot of prog albums, but that's kind of it. Like there's kind of, I think Tarkus is on there. There are a few others as well.
But it's not overly emphasized.
Yeah, it's not overly emphasized, and I think that Jethro Tull's specific brand isn't really truly captured by Aqualung, the only album that they have on there. And this is a much more fun listen, I guess. There's a lot more going on here. So this is one that I would definitely encourage everybody listens to. I've tried to pass this album off to a bunch of people. It's been a lot of swing and a miss so far.
But at least you keep stepping up to the plate, which is good.
All I need is one, and then I'll have
Well, I guess in baseball, isn't that like the most successful hitters hit 300, so they fail 7 out of 10 times. So.
Yeah, I'll take those.
and I guess there's the saying too that the greats are always polarizing. So it feels like this may be one of those albums that you wouldn't walk away from saying it was okay. I guess like you'd either react in a way, like you said, where it's
Absolutely.
a swing and a miss, like you're swinging for the fences and it was, it blew right past them, or it's what would the baseball metaphor be? A home run then, or that sort of thing.
A true outcome player.
Yeah.
Right?
So really, there was no sort of like in between. But so I think that worked well, and I actually have you to thank for the thick as a brick introduction as well from the record store adventure a couple years ago. That's the and I remember that one had fantastic artwork.
Oh,
Does this one? It's not quite the same.
It's not as cool.
Yeah.
Thick as a Brick had that newspaper
Yes.
kind of thing, and there was this whole story about Gerald Bostock, like a boy who won a poetry competition, and like it was just so weird. Passion Play doesn't necessarily have the cool art.
Yeah.
It has a ballerina on it,
Okay.
which is it's cool. But it kind of lends itself to the whole like the record as a play in 4 acts. So
Yes.
the whole theater-y kind of vibe, I guess. But that's something I haven't really dug into. But
Okay.
yeah, the album art is cool though.
Yeah, and it's funny you mentioned the idea of it's being divided into 4 acts, because when I was listening to it, I never actually had the track list in front of me, because it seems like one where it's not individual songs that you'd ever sort of I'm going to put it on shuffle and see what happens, because it's a play, or it's that sort of thing where that matters. Now, did I read correctly? There's an extended edition as well.
Yeah. So I don't know. Are you familiar with Steven Wilson?
I know the name, but
Okay.
not much beyond.
So he is a musician and just like engineer and just like all around like gifted musical
Yeah.
guy. And he's in a band called Porcupine Tree.
Okay.
He's done a bunch of other really cool stuff. So he, over the last decade or so, has been going through and remixing various albums, and he put out a new version of this record and a bunch of other albums, where it restores some of the lost footage. So remember how I was mentioning that there was they had tried to record the album.
Yes.
A lot of that footage was lost. They had to re-record it. So it restores some of that and adds it.
Okay.
And actually, the changes that he made are just amazing. So on the second side, there's one of the only 2 tracks I actually know the name of. There's a track or song or part called "The Foot of Our Stairs."
Right.
And that is my favorite 5 minutes of music ever. And there's a whole verse that was added after the fact. So it was really cool listening to the album on vinyl for years and years growing up. And then
Yes.
to listen to the new Steven Wilson remix.
Yes.
Which is just, it's amazing.
So he just spliced in an extra verse there,
It's like a bunch of, so yeah, there was
Yeah.
like a new like minute and 30, maybe it's not that long, but it's
Yeah.
about like 50 seconds of stuff that just like had been recorded, but
Yes.
they hadn't put it on the record.
Right.
And touched it up and added it, and it makes that song a
Yes.
lot better. But he also just sort of like adjusted the levels and
Yeah.
made everything kind of sound much better. So I think part of the reason for the album, even though it sold well, it wasn't critically successful, was because the band was just like so fed up with like the recording process. And I think the version that Steven Wilson has put out is a lot more in line with what I think would have been produced if that first recording session had gone to plan, and it's a lot more.
And there were fewer bed bugs. And...
Yeah, fewer bed bugs. It's like that's the version. I'm sure if that's the version that they had been able to release when they wanted to,
Right.
people may not have the same negative opinions about the album.
Okay,
and
that's-
now,
yeah.
I mean, if you look on Spotify, I think the default will take you to the Steven Wilson remix version, the 2014
Oh, very
remaster.
cool.
So.
But there's an alternate timeline somewhere where that album came out in '73
Yeah.
and everything went according to plan.
Yeah.
So I like it, and that's a fascinating topic for perhaps another whole series of the best 5 minutes of music as well.
Yeah.
But the song's "Foot of Our Stairs."
Foot of Our
isn't it?
Stairs, yeah.
Nice. And I appreciate that you singled it out as the best, because I always think of the Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy, where they said things like, "This is the 3rd worst thing that's happened." It's like, well, I gotta know what the other 2 are. So if that's the peak, then that's the curiosity can rest.
It's a funny album that way too, because often you never want to be like, oh, you should listen to this record, but like the first 20 minutes is okay, and then the second half is really where it side B is where it comes alive. I think the whole thing is great, but one of the problems with selling it is like it does take a little while to get going. And that second half is so much better than the first. The B side is just like phenomenal. I would hate if someone listened to the first side of the album,
Right.
and then decided
And never turned it over. Yeah. Okay, fair enough. And Foot of Our Stairs arrives towards the end of the second half.
It's at the end of the 3rd act. So
Okay.
it's about It's about the, I don't know, 65
Yes.
cents. It's right after the hare who lost his spectacles.
Okay.
So if you turn it off, the hare who lost his spectacles, you'd never be able to...
It's your loss. So there was a reason to hang on to the end of the tale. So, and I think it ended reasonably happily too. Yeah, he had an extra pair or something. So sorry, spoiler.
That's right. That's right. There was an extra pair. And then he repeats a pair.
So I'll have to listen more carefully the next time I go through for that particular section, because that's very intriguing. And now I'm thinking like, what would my 5 be like? Where, because is that all? Would that be the entire movement? Like the 5 minutes would be entirely within that one movement?
Yeah, I guess like it's funny because I say 5 minutes, but it's so. So if you're listening and you want to give this album a try, it's the last minute and a half of Foot of Our Stairs.
Okay. Round it up to 5.
Yeah.
I like it. But the and that's nice, and I'm pleased that you do keep recommending this one too, because I guess some might get discouraged after the first person said I'm not crazy about it, but it's one I'm very glad you shared with me, because it's one I think I'll keep going back to and keep picking up something different each time. And the musicianship was obviously really solid. Like it would have been probably towards the end of the first side of the LP, just some really frantic drumming happening and that sort of thing. So just some really, really good stuff.
For sure. Yeah, it was Ian Anderson played the flute on pretty much every album, but he kind of stopped playing it this time. There was very little flute on this one. He tried to learn, I think he had already been playing the instrument for a while. He tried to learn the soprano sax,
but
he wasn't very good at it. It's still wonderful. Like, even a guy who's bad at playing the soprano sax, it's like, it sounds so good.
He was going for a new challenge, though. I like it. Well, you've definitely put forth a convincing argument for me that Jethro Tull, A Passion Play, is worthy of consideration as the 1,000-second album. And just wanted to say a huge thank you for your time today, Bryce, and for sharing. And hopefully you're up for a sequel at some point. So if Wayne's World 2 worked out, hopefully Bryce Conway 2 will work out as well.
I'd love it. Yeah, thanks so much. It was an awesome, I love talking about it.
Yeah. This has been the 1,000-second album podcast. Thanks for sharing some of your time, energy, and attention with us today. Take care.